Nandini Varma and her newborn son Arav had just 72 hours to outsmart the Dubai Sheikh's palace. One wrong move would erase them both forever. Arav Zainal Noor was born just before dawn inside a heavily guarded private hospital in Dubai, a place designed to protect powerful secrets. His mother, Nandini Varma Al Noor, lay still as doctors worked in silence, aware that every report written that night would be reviewed by unseen eyes. Nandini had entered the marriage 3 years earlier as a celebrated bride from India, chosen carefully to fit the image of Sheikh Zayed Al Noor's respected family. The wedding had been worth millions, broadcast as a symbol of unity and prestige. From the outside, her life appeared flawless. Inside, it was controlled down to the smallest detail. The moment the baby was born, something shifted. Routine medical tests revealed an inconsistency so serious it froze the room. Blood markers did not align with the Sheikh's lineage, a fact that could not be explained away by error or coincidence. The hospital senior physician quietly updated a secure digital file, knowing exactly where that information would travel next. In families like this, science was not just medicine, it was judgment. Within hours, the Sheikh's internal security team was alerted. Surveillance protocols around Nandini increased without her being informed. Cameras adjusted angles. Guards doubled. Access logs were activated on doors she had walked through freely for years. She sensed it immediately, not through words, but through silence. The staff who once addressed her warmly now moved with distance and caution. Her phone connection weakened. Messages failed to send. Lying in recovery, holding her newborn, Nandini felt fear settle deep inside her chest. She understood the rules of the world she had married into. Honor mattered more than affection. Appearances mattered more than truth. And once a decision was made at the top, there was no appeal below. Somewhere beyond the hospital walls, powerful minds were already calculating timelines. Nandini did not yet know the number, but her time had begun to count due. Nandini's past, carefully buried beneath luxury and new surnames, began to resurface the same day Arav was born. Digital investigators working for the Al Noor family accessed records that predated her marriage, tracing her life back to Mumbai. They found employment files, rental agreements, and private travel data that revealed a version of Nandini the palace had never acknowledged. Before becoming a Sheikh's wife, she had lived independently, far from elite protection, and her life had intersected with people who did not belong in royal narratives. One name appeared repeatedly in old financial records, Karim Malhotra. The connection was not recent, but the timeline was troubling. Bank transfers, overlapping travel dates, and archived photographs suggested a relationship that had not ended as cleanly as claimed. Analysts reconstructed months with forensic precision, comparing dates of absences, international trips, and medical visits. The conclusion formed quietly but firmly. The pregnancy timeline did not match the Sheikh's documented movements. This information was compiled into a confidential report marked for internal review only. Copies never touched paper. Screens were encrypted, access limited to a handful of trusted advisors. In powerful families, truth was dangerous when left uncontrolled. The elders convened that evening in a private residence far from the hospital, where reputation outweighed emotion. The discussion was not about innocence or guilt, but about containment. Back in her hospital room, Nandini sensed the shift without seeing the evidence. Her legal advisor failed to arrive. A scheduled visit from a family representative was canceled without explanation. The silence grew heavier with every passing hour. She realized that her history, once dismissed as irrelevant, was now the very thing shaping her future. What frightened her most was not exposure, but certainty. The people investigating her did not rush. They were thorough, patient, and the change in Nandini's world became impossible to ignore by the next morning. The hospital room felt smaller, as if the walls themselves had moved closer overnight. A new security officer stood outside her door, replacing the familiar face from the previous shift. Her medical chart was no longer left at the foot of the bed. Even the nurse rotations changed, with strangers entering quietly and leaving without conversation. Nothing was said, yet everything was communicated. When Nandini attempted to contact her family in India, the call failed repeatedly. The hospital phone showed a connection error, and her personal device displayed full signal but no service. It was a subtle form of isolation, carefully designed to avoid panic while preventing escape. Meals arrived on schedule, but the warmth was gone. The care felt procedural, distant, and monitored. Later that day, she noticed that her baby was taken for extended checkups, without clear explanations. Hours passed before Ariv was returned. The cradle was repositioned closer to the door, always within view of the security camera. Nandini began to understand that the child was no longer fully hers. He had become evidence. As night approached, whispers moved through the corridors. She caught fragments of phrases from staff who assumed she could not understand Arabic well enough to notice. A number surfaced again and again, spoken carefully, almost respectfully. 72. No unit was attached, but meaning did not require one. In that family, timelines were final. Fear sharpened Nandini's senses. She memorized patterns. When guards changed, which doors opened quietly, which elevators paused longer than others. She watched reflections in glass instead of turning her head. The luxury of the hospital no longer comforted her. It only reminded her of how much control surrounded her. As she lay awake, counting seconds between footsteps, Nandini accepted a truth she could no longer avoid. This was not about reconcilia. By the fourth day since the birth, Nandini understood that waiting was more dangerous than acting. Her passport and identification had been removed under the excuse of hospital administration, a common procedure she knew was irreversible. When she asked for paperwork, the request vanished into polite delays. She realized that legality no longer applied to her situation. Everything happening was internal, controlled, and silent. She began searching her memory instead of her surroundings. Years earlier, before her marriage, she had prepared for uncertainty in a way she never thought she would need. A safety deposit box existed under the name Anaya's son, registered through an offshore service in Singapore. Inside were copies of documents, emergency cash, and a contact number she had sworn never to use. That plan had been created during a time when her life felt unstable, long before luxury replaced caution. Now, it was the only thing separating her from erasure. The challenge was movement. Every exit from the hospital required authorization. Guards logged elevator use and tracked visitor badges. Even her medical transfers were escorted, so she shifted her focus to observation. She tracked how long security checks took during staff shift changes. She noticed that supply carts moved freely between floors with minimal inspection. Maintenance teams followed predictable routes, especially during early morning hours. Nandini also realized something else. The system watching her was efficient but overconfident. It assumed fear would paralyze her. That assumption became her advantage. She maintained the appearance of compliance, resting when expected, following instructions without resistance. Inside, her mind worked constantly, stitching together fragments of opportunity. Every hour mattered now. The 72-hour mark was approaching faster than she liked to admit. Nandini no longer thought about clearing her name or correcting the record. Her goal narrowed to a single. The confirmation arrived without ceremony. Late that evening, Nandini noticed unfamiliar names added to her medical file, legal consultants rather than doctors. A digital document briefly appeared on a shared tablet before the screen was locked again. She caught enough to understand its purpose. Her name was being prepared for removal, not through divorce or public scandal, but through administrative silence. The process was designed to leave no disruption, no questions, and no trace. Shortly after, her baby was taken once more, this time without a return schedule. Staff explained it as routine observation, yet no updates followed. Hours passed. The absence felt intentional. Nandini realized the child's fate was being evaluated separately from hers. In families like the Al-Noors, bloodlines mattered more than birth certificates. If the child could not be claimed, it could be reassigned, hidden, or erased. That night, Nandini counted the remaining time by the sound of footsteps outside her door. Each hour brought the sense of something closing in. She understood that once the internal paperwork was finalized, her physical presence would become inconvenient. Powerful systems did not act in anger. They acted in sequence. The legal step always came first, followed by the physical one. What terrified her most was the calm. There were no threats, no raised voices, no visible conflict. Everything moved smoothly, like a machine completing a routine task. She saw now that this was not punishment, but correction. A mistake was being removed from the family narrative. Nandini's fear hardened into resolve. She could no longer wait for perfect timing. Any delay increased the risk of losing access to her child permanently. The escape plan in her mind shifted from possibility to necessity. She accepted that leaving would mean abandoning every protection she had gained through marriage. Yet staying meant losing her identity, her child, and possibly her life. As dawn approached, Nandini activated the final layer of her plan just before sunrise. Using a hospital-issued tablet left briefly unattended, she accessed an internal service request system and submitted a routine medical supply update tied to her room number. Hidden within the request was a code phrase she had memorized years earlier, a signal recognized only by a small underground network that helped people disappear across borders. It was a risk, but it was the only signal she could send without drawing attention. By midday, subtle confirmations appeared. A nurse named Salma Rahui was added to the rotation, assigned specifically to postnatal recovery. Salma moved differently from the others, efficient but observant, noting details without staring. Small changes followed. Medication schedules shifted. A transfer note appeared suggesting additional neonatal imaging in another wing. The paperwork looked ordinary, but the timing was precise. Nandini understood the rules immediately. No hesitation, no improvisation. Every step had to appear medically justified. The baby was returned briefly, just long enough for Nandini to notice a small mark on the blanket, a symbol stitched in blue thread that confirmed coordination. The network was active. Behind the scenes, Salma adjusted records, rerouting digital trails so movements appeared duplicated in two places at once. Security feeds would later show conflicting data, enough to delay certainty, but not enough to trigger an immediate lockdown. The escape would rely on confusion, not force. As evening approached, Nandini prepared mentally for separation from everything familiar. She dressed simply, avoiding anything distinctive. The child was wrapped in standard hospital fabric, indistinguishable from dozens of others. There would be no dramatic exit, only a quiet transfer masked as procedure. What Nandini did not know was how narrow the margin had become. The family's internal deadline was approaching faster than expected. Once the window of opportunity opened just after midnight, during a scheduled systems test that briefly lowered the hospital's internal security sensitivity. Lights dimmed in non-critical corridors, and several cameras switched to backup loops. It was a routine procedure meant to check resilience, but for Nandini, it marked the only moment when patterns would break. Salma Rahui arrived precisely then, pushing a supply cart stacked with sealed containers and medical linens. Everything about it matched protocol. Nandini was transferred onto a gurney under the label of post-surgical imaging, her baby placed beside her in a transparent neonatal carrier. Digital records updated automatically, reflecting movement to an underground diagnostics unit. The elevator they used was reserved for logistics, rarely questioned and never crowded. As it descended, Nandini focused on stillness, knowing that any sign of panic could draw attention. The underground corridor smelled of disinfectant and machinery. Staff moved quickly, absorbed in their own tasks. No one looked twice. At the service junction, Salma diverted the cart toward waste processing, a route designed for efficiency rather than scrutiny. The carrier holding Ariv was concealed beneath layered linens, indistinguishable from hospital returns. At the loading bay, a commercial laundry vehicle waited with its engine running. Its manifest listed routine pickup, authorized hours earlier through a duplicated access key. The transfer took seconds. Once inside the vehicle, the doors closed and sealed automatically. By the time the outer gate scanned the license plate, the system had already validated the exit. As the vehicle merged into the quiet Dubai streets, Nandini felt the first shift in control since the birth. The city moved on around them, unaware of what had just slipped through its defenses. Behind them, the hospital continued to function, alarms silent, records clean. What Nandini did not know yet was that the dissipate. Freedom lasted less than an hour before it turned into a new kind of danger. The laundry vehicle delivered Nandini to a storage facility near the industrial port, where the network shifted her into a windowless van with no markings. Phones were destroyed. Clothing was changed. The city she once knew became something to avoid rather than trust. Every route was indirect, designed to confuse anyone tracking movement patterns. News of her absence reached the Al Noor estate just before dawn. At first, it was treated as a systems error. Internal reports showed Nandini in 2 locations at once, a technical impossibility that delayed action. When the contradiction was resolved, the response was swift but contained. No public alert was issued. The matter remained private, handled through personal channels rather than law enforcement. Safe houses rotated rapidly. Nandini and the baby were moved 3 times in one day, each location smaller and less visible than the last. Curtains stayed closed. Food arrived without conversation. Instructions were brief and written, then destroyed. The goal was not comfort, but invisibility. By evening, the plans shifted again. Airports were no longer an option. Passenger manifests were too exposed, and private terminals were controlled by the same influence she was escaping. The network rerouted toward the coast, where oversight weakened and records blurred. Meanwhile, a controlled narrative began forming inside the family. A medical complication was cited. A private transfer was mentioned. Questions were discouraged. In powerful circles, silence was enforced through reputation rather than force. Nandini understood that escape was not a single event, but a process. Each mile away from the hospital only placed her into another layer of risk. She could not stop moving, not yet. The system hunting her was patient, well-funded, and unused to failure. As night fell near the port, she watched the distant lights of the city fade and realized some. As dawn approached, the cargo vessel slipped quietly from the harbor, blending into the steady rhythm of commercial traffic leaving the Gulf. Nandini remained hidden below deck, the air heavy with fuel and salt. The baby slept against her chest, unaware that his existence had already shifted power and fate. The ship's destination was intentionally vague, logged under a chain of subcontractors that blurred responsibility. Once beyond territorial waters, jurisdiction would fracture, and with it, urgency. Hours passed before confirmation reached the Al Noor family that the port routes had been compromised. By then, the vessel was already part of open sea traffic, one among hundreds. Private trackers were deployed, but without official authority, searches depended on cooperation that never fully arrived. Influence weakened with every nautical mile. On board, Nandini followed strict instructions. She did not approach the deck during daylight. Supplies were delivered without names. No questions were asked. The network treated her not as a client, but as a liability that needed to survive long enough to vanish. Every measure taken was designed to erase continuity between who she had been and who she would become. Days later, the ship docked briefly at a secondary port where documents were exchanged again. Arif received a new identity tied to a different nationality. Nandini's name shifted once more, layered under legal ambiguity that would frustrate any future inquiry. By the time the search slowed, the trail had already gone cold. Without public pressure, resources were quietly redirected. The story inside the family closed itself, sealed by reputation and control. Nandini understood then that survival did not come from running forever, but from becoming unfindable. The ocean had not just carried her away from danger. It had dissolved the last clear link to her past. Years passed without a traceable record of what truly happened inside that Dubai hospital. Official files remained sealed, protected by influence and silence. The disappearance of Nandini Varma Al-Noor was never reported publicly, and without a body or accusation, the story faded into private memory. Within elite circles, her name became something unspoken, a problem resolved rather than a mystery unsolved. On the other side of the world, in a quiet coastal town near Cascais, Portugal, a woman named Alina Veres lived a life designed to attract no attention. She worked remotely, paid in cash-heavy contracts, and moved homes often enough to avoid patterns. To her neighbors, she was reserved but polite. To her son, she was simply his mother. The boy, known as Theo Veres, grew up unaware that his existence had once triggered a countdown measured in hours. Nandini never returned to India, nor did she seek justice. She understood that courts required visibility, and visibility invited danger. Instead, she chose obscurity. The past was locked away, surviving only in documents scattered across jurisdictions that would never align. Occasionally, news from the Middle East surfaced on international screens. Business expansions, philanthropic gestures, carefully managed images of stability. Nothing ever referenced the woman who vanished or the child removed from lineage. The system that had once hunted her continued forward, unchallenged and intact. What remained was not closure, but survival. Nandini had escaped, not because the system failed, but because it underestimated her willingness to disappear completely. The true crime was never officially recorded. Yet somewhere between erased files and rewritten identities, a truth endured quietly. In the end, the most dangerous moment was not the escape itself, but the decision to leave everything behind. And that choice, made under pressure and silence, was the one thing no power could undo.